Hello and welcome back to Myths and Misadventures from the National Hellenic Museum. My name is Cairo and I am your storyteller, and in this series I share stories about gods, heroes, and monsters from Greek mythology. And today is part 3 of our discussion of the Olympians. Today I'm going to tell you a couple tales that have to do with the twins, Apollo and Artemis. The version of the stories that I will be telling today come from excerpts of Delaire's book of Greek myths by Ingrid and Edgar Parin. More information is in the description of this video. And without further ado, let's get mythical. Zeus had married the goddess Leto, and when Hera found out that Leto was expecting twins, she flew into a jealous rage and ordered all the lands in the world to refuse Leto shelter. Chased away from every land, poor Leto wandered from place to place and could not rest to give birth to her twins. At last she came to Delos, and the little island welcomed her. Since it was still floating and was not quite land, it was free from Hera's bidding. Exhausted, Leto sank down in the shade of the palm tree, but still she could not give birth to her twins, for Hera forbade Eilithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to go to her. Without her help, no child could be born. All the other goddesses felt sorry for Leto and tried to sway Hera by offering her a beautiful necklace. It was 9 yards long, of gold and amber, and Hera could not resist it. She let Eilithyia go, and Iris whisked her down the rainbow to Leto. Leto's first child was Artemis, a girl as beautiful as the moon, with hair as dark as the night. She was to be the goddess of the hunt and all newborn creatures. Then Apollo came into the world. He was to be as fair as the sun and was to be the god of music, light, and reason. Zeus was filled with joy at the sight of his beautiful twins, and he gave them each a silver bow and a quiver full of arrows. The arrows of Artemis were soft as moonbeams and brought a painless death. Those of Apollo were hard and piercing as the rays of the sun. Zeus blessed the little island and fastened it to the bottom of the sea. Grass and flowers burst forth from the barren ground, and Delos became the richest of all the Greek islands. Pilgrims flocked to it and loaded it with temples and treasures to honor Leto and her twins. Apollo grew rapidly, as all gods did, and when he was full grown, Zeus sent him off on a chariot drawn by white swans to win for himself the oracle of Delphi. No place in Greece was as sacred as Delphi, on the steep slopes of Mount Parnassus. Sulphurous fumes rose from a deep cleft in the mountainside. A Sibyl, the priestess of Delphi, sat on a tripod over the cleft, and the vapors put her into a magic sleep. In her dreams, the Sibyl heard the voice of Mother Earth coming up from the depths, and she repeated the mystic words she heard. Priests stood around the Sibyl and explained the meanings of her muttered prophecies to the pilgrims who had come to the oracle to learn of their futures. The oracle was guarded by the darksome dragon, Python, who lay coiled around the sacred place. Old age had made him mean and so ill-tempered that the nymphs fled from the sacred spring nearby, and the birds no longer dared to sing in the trees. The oracle had warned Python that Leto's son would one day destroy him. He had tried to devour Leto when she was wandering about looking for a place to give birth to her children, but she had escaped. When the old black dragon saw radiant Apollo flying toward him in his golden chariot, he knew his last hour had come. But he sold his life dearly. He unleashed his fury, spitting fire and venom, and his black, scaly body did not stop its writhing and coiling until Apollo had shot him with 1,000 of his silver shafts. In torrents did the dragon's venom flow down the mountainside, and the oracle of Delphi was Apollo's. Now there was light and joy in the once somber slopes of Mount Parnassus. The air was filled with sweet tunes as the birds in the sky and the nymphs of the sacred spring returned to sing Apollo's praises. The voice of the young god rose above all the others, for he was the god of music. Artemis, as a newborn goddess, went to her father, Zeus, and asked him to grant her a wish. She wanted to remain forever a wild young maiden hunting through the woods, and she asked him to promise never to make her marry. Zeus consented, and then she asked him for 50 fleet nymphs as companions and a pack of lop-eared hounds to hunt with. Her father gave her all she asked, and she herself caught 4 hinds with golden antlers and harnessed them to her silver chariot. When the moon's magic light shone over echoing hills and wooded valleys, Artemis hunted with her nymphs and her hounds. After a wild hunt, the goddess loved to bathe in a quiet pool. Woe to the mortal who happened to see her then. Apollo and Artemis, though as different as day and night, were fond of each other. Apollo had many wives, but Zeus kept his promise to Artemis and never made her marry. Only once, she promised her hand to a suitor, but that was a promise that she had no intention of keeping. The suitor was Otis, a gigantic son of Poseidon. Otis and his brother Ephialtes were almost 60 feet tall when they reached manhood, and still they went on growing. The gods watched them with concern, for an oracle had predicted that neither gods nor mortals could kill the giant brothers. Mother Earth, however, watched them with pleasure. She was still angry with Zeus for keeping her sons, the Titans, in Tartarus, and she hoped that Otis and Ephialtes would grow big enough to overthrow him. One night, as the brothers slept with their ears to the ground, they heard Mother Earth whisper that such tall and handsome youths should not let themselves be ruled by Zeus. That was just what they had been thinking themselves, for they were vain, as many strong people are. They pulled up mountains, piled them on top of each other, and built a vast new mountain as high as Olympus. From the top they called to Zeus to surrender his powers to them and move out of his palace with the other Olympians. Artemis could stay and become his bride, shouted Otis, and Ephialtes would take Hera. The two goddesses tossed their heads with scorn, and Zeus, in a fury, hurled thunderbolts at the ruffians. Zeus's thunderbolts glanced off harmlessly, and when Ares rushed out to fight them, they grabbed him and crammed him into a bronze jar and clamped the lid shut. For once, Zeus was really worried, but Apollo, the god of reason, said that if no one could kill them, they must be tricked into killing each other. He persuaded Artemis to pretend that she was in love with Otis. Otis smirked when Apollo called to him that Artemis thought so much of him that she had accepted his proposal and would wait for him on the island of Naxos. That made Ephialtes jealous. Why hadn't Hera fallen in love with him? Wasn't he as handsome as his brother? But he swallowed his pride and went to Naxos with his brother to meet the bride. When Artemis saw the two brothers arriving, she quickly changed herself into a white deer and ran across their path. She darted to and fro between them and the brothers, who were eager huntsmen, threw their javelins at the deer. Cleverly, she dodged, and the brothers fell to the ground, pierced by each other's javelins. Neither gods nor mortals could kill the giant brothers, but now they had put an end to each other, and were thrown into Tartarus tied back to back with writhing snakes. All the gods thanked Artemis for saving them, and pulled Ares out of the jar where he had been crouching, all the while howling and screaming. Orion was another giant son of Poseidon, but unlike Otis and Ephialtes, he was modest. He was a great hunter. No beast could escape from his club and jeweled sword, but he never forgot to praise Artemis, the greatest of all hunters. He walked from island to island hunting, and after a while he came to the island of Crete. There he met the goddess Artemis. She was glad to see him, for he could hunt as well as she, and was so very modest about it. Together they hunted wild goats and rejoiced in each other's company. Orion was the only man Artemis had ever favored, and her brother Apollo grew jealous. One day, while Artemis was away, he sent an enormous scorpion to attack Orion. Orion's club and mighty sword were of no avail against the scorpion's poisonous tail. He turned to flee, but as he did, the giant insect stung his heel. Artemis was angry with her brother when she returned and found her companion dead. But she could not stay angry with her twin for long, and he helped her hang Orion's image in the skies as a constellation, so the great hunter would never be forgotten. Over the stormy winter sea, the constellation of Orion glitters, enormous and menacing, and the dark clouds flee before him like wild animals. But in the summer, when the constellation of the Scorpion rises over the horizon, Orion begins to sway and stagger, and then, in his turn, flees and disappears into the ocean. Now you may have noticed a name in the last of our tales from today. Orion might sound familiar to you, And if you are familiar at all with constellations, then you might be familiar with the constellation of Orion, or perhaps more specifically Orion's Belt, a string of 3 stars. This is the story that gives that constellation its name. And this is far from the only constellation that has an associated story with it within mythology, in Greek mythology, but also mythologies across cultures. Many cultures have their own stories and their own constellations that they see quite literally written in the stars. It falls under a similar category, I think, to something else that we have already discussed a bit on this channel, which is that mythology stories often seek to explain observable phenomenon that was not otherwise explainable. Similarly, when we look up at the sky and see drawings out there, human beings have long made stories associated with them that we see written in the stars now when we look up at the sky. Orion and the scorpion that pursues him across the sky every year are 2 examples of constellations that have mythology stories attached to them that seek to explain how the shapes came to be there, in this case, Orion being hung in the stars by Artemis to remember her lost friend. The ancient Greeks are not the only culture to see stories in the stars and create meaning around the shapes they saw there. Ancient China is another robust example of a culture seeing shapes, places, and things in the sky and tracking the stars accordingly. If you would like to draw the events of the story today as you imagine them and feel like sharing, ask a parent to help you submit your artwork to the National Hellenic Museum. There's information on how to submit your art in the description of this video. I hope I captured your imagination, and I look forward to sharing another story from Greek mythology with you soon. Until next time.